Let's be honest. When Meghan Markle first entered the royal spotlight, she had Britain captivated. A glamorous Hollywood actress marrying cheeky, beloved Prince Harry, it was the perfect fairytale headline. The wedding felt like something out of a storybook. Crowds cheered, papers gushed, and for a moment, it seemed like the monarchy had finally stepped into a new era. Modern, progressive, exciting. But only a few years later, the mood had shifted. The narrative around Meghan didn't sour overnight because of racism or class snobbery, as she and her supporters often suggest. The real turning point came when the public began to notice a pattern, a sense of entitlement. Here was someone who had married into one of the most privileged families on earth, yet soon positioned herself as a victim of that very system. The dramatic Oprah interview sealed that image. Not for its revelations, but for how seamlessly it transformed Meghan from dazzling Duchess to oppressed outsider. It was a masterclass in rebranding victimhood as identity. And then there's Oprah. Once celebrated as the champion of empowerment, the woman who built her empire on resilience, responsibility, and triumph, her role in that interview raised eyebrows. Instead of challenging her guest to rise above, she gave space to a narrative crafted for outrage and sympathy. That wasn't tough journalism. It was theater. A therapy session dressed as primetime television, meticulously staged and perfectly timed. Critics like Charlie Kirk were quick to call it out. While many danced around sensitive topics, he cut straight to the heart of it. Meghan wasn't pushed out, she walked out. And she didn't walk empty-handed. She left with millions, a lucrative Netflix deal, and a carefully polished victim narrative. According to Kirk, this was never about discrimination, it was about attitude. The relentless press manipulation. The refusal to respect protocol. The subtle disdain for tradition. The superiority cloaked as social justice. People saw it, and they grew weary. And here's the truth, you don't have to be a monarchist to recognize it. This isn't about protecting the crown. It's about seeing through the performance. The moment Meghan realized she couldn't control the palace narrative, she went where she could, into the arms of cameras ready to script her story her way. She left, turned the institution that had once embraced her into her villain, and recast herself as the wronged outsider. But the story doesn't end there. After all the interviews, the documentaries, the bombshells, Meghan and Harry are slowly being welcomed back, quietly, strategically. Their photos remain on the royal website. They're reappearing at select events. And the palace PR machine is carefully laying the groundwork. Why? That's the real question. Because if you think this is simply about family reconciliation, you're missing the bigger picture. Something far more calculated is unfolding, an agenda that rewards those who weaponize identity and profit from tearing down tradition. Tradition has a way of being twisted, reshaped, even weaponized. Personal choices get spun into political statements. While Charlie Kirk was slammed for saying what many were already thinking, Meghan was cashing in, perfecting the role of the oppressed Duchess on the world stage. And somehow, we were all expected to keep treating her as the misunderstood heroine. But what unsettled people most wasn't just her performance. It was how effortlessly powerful institutions lined up behind her. The media never pressed for proof. Oprah handed her the spotlight. Netflix gave her the megaphone. And the headlines? Predictable, relentless. Meghan Markle, driven out by racism. No names, no evidence, just enough to ignite a cultural firestorm. The moment she spoke those words, that someone in the royal family asked how dark her baby's skin might be, it was like a spark thrown onto dry kindling. No context, no follow-up, just accusation. And it worked. Headlines exploded, Twitter raged, the palace scrambled. Meghan had played her role with precision. She knew when to cry, when to pause, when to strike. And while she manipulated perception, the bigger failure was the system itself. Nobody dared to push back. Nobody asked the questions. Except Charlie Kirk. Love him or hate him, he didn't tiptoe, he didn't soften. He said it flat out, Meghan wasn't a victim. She was a manipulator, blending royalty and identity politics into a brand built on sympathy, fame, and cash. But instead of debate, instead of disagreement, the response was outrage. Because people don't always want truth, they want stories that make them feel good about being angry. Meghan gave them exactly that. A beautiful woman of color crushed by a cold, archaic institution. A perfect villain to hate, a perfect heroine to defend. It was comforting fiction. And Charlie refused to play along. Then there's Harry. Once the fun royal, the rebellious prince people adored for being real. Now, he looks hollow, like a man who traded his independence for a California mansion and a podcast mic. And yet, every time he returns to the UK, the palace greets him with open arms. They call it reconciliation, but let's be honest, it looks more like a PR reboot. Because let's not forget, Harry and Meghan built their fortune by tearing down the very monarchy that raised them. They accused it of racism. They mocked its traditions. They dragged the Queen's legacy through the mud. And now, they slip back in while William and Catherine carry on quietly, no tantrums, no interviews, just service. That's the contrast. Integrity doesn't trend. Quiet dignity doesn't go viral. What sells is drama, victimhood, and spectacle. Manipulation dressed up as courage, that's why Meghan's story sells so well. It has everything: royalty, race, rebellion, and a ready-made villain, the monarchy. It's Netflix ready, Oprah approved, social media tested. And for those pulling strings behind the curtain, it's simply too profitable to resist. But there's a third player in this saga, one people whisper about but rarely criticize: Oprah. That's where the drama shifts from personal conflict to something far bigger. Oprah once symbolized resilience. For decades, she was the face of rising from nothing and transforming pain into power. Her interviews used to mean redemption, accountability, growth. But now, she's become another figurehead in the culture of grievance. She didn't give Meghan a stage to be questioned, she gave her a pulpit to be worshipped. And when the monarchy was accused of racism on national television without evidence, Oprah never blinked. It wasn't journalism. It was theater. An infomercial for victimhood. And that's the unsettling part. Oprah's platform still carries enormous weight. She could have pressed for clarity, asked the questions the world wanted answered. Instead, she handed Meghan the mic and let one of the most powerful smear campaigns in modern royal history take root. This wasn't about clearing the air. It was about rewriting an image, tearing down a family, and weaponizing public outrage. The strangest twist. The very monarchy Meghan and Harry tried to dismantle is now quietly letting them back in. Harry appears on official websites and pamphlets, presented not as a disgraced ex-royal, but as a figure of goodwill and charity. Meghan stays in the background, far enough to dodge direct criticism, but close enough to reap the benefits. So the question is, why? Why would King Charles, of all people, allow the return of a couple who spent years torching the crown's reputation? It feels less like diplomacy and more like surrender. You don't invite back the people who set fire to your house while the ashes are still warm. That isn't strategy. That's weakness. And then comes the silence. The media, once obsessed, now barely whispers. Voices that defended the monarchy have gone quiet. Even William and Catherine, the steady, reliable backbone of the family, are being edged aside. Fewer appearances, less spotlight, reduced visibility. Why? Because they're too stable, too composed. No chaos. No tantrums. And quiet dignity doesn't sell. Drama does. That's the tragedy. Meghan is packaged as a revolutionary, but underneath she's a well-connected opportunist. Her persona is stitched with contradictions. She asks for privacy, but only when the cameras stay close. She demands justice, but only when she's never questioned. She craves respect, yet refuses to give any to the institution that elevated her. And through it all, powerful people keep feeding the machine, amplifying her voice, silencing dissent. Charlie Kirk dared to break the spell. He said the uncomfortable truth out loud. He didn't sugarcoat it. He simply pointed out what many thought but were too afraid to voice. For that, he was branded hateful, dangerous, wrong. But he wasn't wrong, he was inconvenient. And in today's world, being inconvenient to the narrative is enough to erase you. And that's the real tragedy here. This was never just about Harry, Meghan, or Oprah. It's about power, stories, and who gets to control the truth.